The 58th annual meetings of the African Development Bank played host to a number of side events, such as the Memorandum of Understanding signed by the governors of the BDIR 15 constituency, which comprises of the Gambia, Ghana, Senegal, Sudan, as well as Liberia, which is worth about a commitment of $8 million. And also one of the highlights we saw this year was the African Investment Forum presenting about 4 different renewable energy and sustainability projects to investors, which is worth about $1.5 billion. Hello and welcome to this special broadcast, bringing you highlights from the sidelines of the 58th annual meetings of the African Development Bank here in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. One of such events is the African Development Bank Group's panel session on the launch of the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation and how this propels regional production capacity in the pharmaceutical sector to position the continent favorably against the shocks of global pandemics. A media launch with the president of the AfDB briefs journalists from across the continent and beyond on more of the expected outcomes from the week-long event, which focuses discussion points around mobilizing Africa's private sector for climate and green growth.
You need to have bankable projects that they can put the money in, and that's why the African Development Bank, we have the project preparation facility. We also support Africa 50, which is a private equity fund that I chair its board, to prepare bankable projects. Secondly, is that we have to be able to de-risk the investments, because people say, well, I'm not used to Africa, I'm not used to the whether it's market risk, project risk, or political risk. The African Development Bank has a suite of instruments that we use in terms of partial credit guarantees and partial risk guarantees to reduce risk facing a private sector when they actually either invest among themselves or they invest with the government. Sure. And the third thing, which is also very important for us, is the policy environment. Sure. When the private sector, when private sector invests money, it's like water. It always finds the path of least resistance. Indeed. So if your policy environment is not stable, if your investment environment is not friendly, well, guess what? Private sector never goes there. Sure. And so we are working to do that, and that's why, as you know very well, you cover this for us, the Africa Investment Forum, which has become the continent's premier investment platform. We've mobilized $143 billion in the last 3 years, as you know. So we're going to have our 2023 Africa Investment Forum in Marrakesh, in Morocco this year. And our focus will also be on how to be able to attract a lot of private sector investments.
Absolutely. And I know that one of the conversations that you're also having here is a conversation that I had at the IMF meetings and World Bank in Washington at the spring meetings about ensuring that the global financial architecture is one that enables Africa to be a key participant. I wanted to know from a bank perspective what role you're playing in that, given you as a preeminent financial development institution and what you do on the continent.
Well, clearly, we all face a lot of challenges globally. Here we are, Africa is recovering just from COVID-19 situation. Now we've got to deal with climate change, we've got to deal with debt, we have to deal with conflicts, we have to deal with global inflationary pressures and other geopolitical risks. Now, the issue is the amount of money needed is a lot. And so we need to do a number of things as a global financial architecture very, very well. Sure. First, we should coordinate better, right?
As Africa?
No, as a global financial architecture, which includes the World Bank, which includes the IMF, which includes the multilateral development banks. We need to coordinate better. With the IMF focusing a lot on its macroeconomic stabilization and fiscal stabilization, and the multilateral development banks focusing on making sure that we can support investments, we can support development in water, in energy, in education, infrastructure, and all of that. So that complementarity is very important. And secondly, is the fact that we need to actually change our business model. Sure. Because to be able to attract a lot of private sector.
Is that from a bank perspective or is that from a continental perspective?
No, from a bank perspective.
From a bank perspective.
Because there was a G20 capital adequacy reform report that asked all multilateral development banks to change their business model, right, to be able to attract a lot more money from the private sector. Well, the good part for me is that the African Development Bank has been ahead of the curve, even way before that. What have we done? We worked together to launch the first synthetic securitization by a multilateral development bank globally, where we took some of our portfolio off our private sector portfolio and we transferred it to institutional investors in the private sector. First done anywhere in the world by a multilateral financial institution.
Sure.
Just last year, we got another deal with the support of UK government, which we call room to run, giving more room to be able to run. We took again portfolio of our books, our non-sovereign portfolios, and we transferred it again to the private sector, another leader in that particular area.
Sure.
And third is the fact that in the global financial architecture, the money that we have on the table today that can do a lot are the special drawing rights of the IMF.
Yes.
The IMF issued $650 billion of special drawing rights. They are reserve assets. Africa got $33 billion, which is about 4.5% of that. But the countries that don't need it got most of it.
Yeah.
The countries that need it didn't get enough of it.
Absolutely.
But what we've been talking about is how can we have a world wherein those that have it and they don't need it can rechannel it to the developing countries, in our case Africa, that we desperately need it. So the African governments, heads of state have said that $100 billion should be rechanneled to Africa. But part of that to go through the African Development Bank. And why? Because we are a AAA rated financial institution, the only one in Africa, and we can leverage. The key is the word leverage. We can leverage every single dollar of the special drawing rights 3 to 4 times. A $10 billion allocation to us becomes $30 billion to $40 billion allocation going back to African countries. And so, but the problem, you see, has always been how do we ensure that those that are going to give those SDRs, if they choose to do it voluntarily, that you can assure them that their SDRs are not going to be lost, that they meet a reserve asset quality, that they can get it back when they want, and so on. So that has been a turning point. But in the multilateral development banks, African Development Bank has been the leader on this particular issue. But I'm glad to tell you that today, we stuck with it. We finally got a financial structure that we presented to the IMF staff, and they agreed that our structure now fully meets the reserve asset quality for the special drawing rights of the IMF, which means that developed countries can reallocate or rechannel some of those SDRs to the African Development Bank. It's going to be a big, big game changer. So what we need now is 5 countries to be able to do that. I was in Japan just about a few weeks ago, and I met with Vice Minister of Finance of Japan, who said that Japan expects to announce at the G7 that was just finished yesterday, a contribution towards the African Development Bank of SDRs. We're talking to the UK government, who have promised that they can do about £500 million towards us, and we are still in conversations about that. I met with the Saudis, I met with the UAE, who also are positively disposed to consider proposals from us on that. So these are the ways in which we, as African Development Bank, are positioning ourselves and using our own business models to show leadership in innovations to leverage more resources for Africa.
I sit down with the chief economist of the AfDB unpacks details of the African economic outlook for this year.
Africa's economy has continued to show remarkable resilience. Despite all the confluence of challenges that we've seen, we have COVID, and then the aftermath of the recovery from COVID is still there, lingering. And then we have the Russia's war in Ukraine, which also has created a lot of spillover effects in energy prices, in consumer price, in inflation for food and other materials that are imported from those countries. And also you have the other challenges around the global conflicts that has continued to happen. And more importantly, to the subject of this meeting, the losses and damages that countries continue to suffer from climate change impacts. So this has created a confluence of factors that has exacerbated challenges with regard to debt and debt sustainability, which I will come to. But even within all these challenges, the African economy is projected to slow from 4.8 that we projected in 2021 to 3.8 in 2022. But then 3.8% growth in GDP in 2022. But our projection is that it will rebound to 4% at the end of this year and up to 4.4%, 4.3% by 2024. And this projection of 3.8 in 2022 is much higher than the 3.4 average growth we see globally. And then when you look into the macroeconomic fundamentals on this continent, you see that things are going in the right direction. Fiscal deficits are narrowing. Current account deficits might expand a little, but it's not too much compared to what you see in other regions. And then also you find that the continent continues to remain on a positive trajectory of growth even across the regions. If you look at all the countries on the continent, you find that 5 out of the fastest growing countries in Africa will rejoin the league of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world. So this is just Africa claiming 5 seats amongst the 10 fastest growing countries in the world. That's very phenomenal, because the projections during COVID and all these crises was that Africa was not going to be able to shoulder to absorb those risks and continue to move forward. And this is because of a lot of macroeconomic policy reforms that has been implemented by our leaders. And it's important here to commend them for the great work that's been done in the past decade. We are seeing a very good positive direction. East Africa is the only region on this continent that was able to escape recession even during the peak of COVID-19, and has continued to go in an upward direction. And now they are growing at more than 5% across that region. So if you look in to see what is going on there, the economies are much more diversified, and then the fiscal and monetary policies that are also being implemented there are quite often and consistent, and not significant policy reversals are not happening as in many parts of the continent. And then there's also several other issues that has helped them so much, because a lot of their economies are tourism dependent, and because of the resurgence of tourism and tourist incomes, you had their GDP grew much higher than other regions in 2022. Because of the diversification of their economies, then the shocks. Normally, when you have, the best way to hedge risks is to diversify your portfolio. And because the sources of growth in these countries are more diversified than in other regions, they are not highly dependent on the external flows. And because of that, then it becomes easier for them to absorb the shock and continue to progress even after shocks. But other economies, for example, that suffer most are resource-dependent economies, where the prices of materials that you sell in the global market goes up, then your economy goes up. If it comes down, then you come down. So that extensive dependence on export markets is the point that we try to address in the chapter 3 of the report on how to leverage our own natural capital to be able to mobilize domestic revenue to address the challenges that we're talking about. This time around, Southern Africa as a whole is projected to see a deceleration in growth to about 1.6%. But again, that is because largely of structural challenges, especially in the energy sector in South Africa. Because of course, you know that the more power you have, the more industrial production can happen. So access to electricity is highly linked to GDP growth. And in the past few years, South Africa has really had quite significant challenges. And because it's a large economy, when South African economy is suffering, the whole region tends to suffer with it. The same is happening in Nigeria. Because of structural challenges, Nigeria has not been able to take advantage of the hike in the prices of oil that is one of the effects of these Russia-Ukraine war that we've talked about. And there are several other issues, structural issues, that holds down growth on the continent, in that country. And a few of the large economies on the continent, except Angola, actually suffered significant currency devaluation that also led to significant inflationary pressures. So these are all the confluences of factors that have made much of the more exposed economies on the continent suffer more. in terms of growth than others.
The annual meetings also saw finance ministers of the Gambia, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone and Sudan sign a memorandum of understanding totaling $8 million to enhance the country's domestic resource mobilization, expand private sector-led economic growth while enhancing climate resilience and even contribute to the replenishment of the African Development Fund, the soft loan arm of the AfDB.
The significance of the MOU is the emphasis of the constituent member countries agreeing to take their national development agenda into their own hands by allocating a portion of their national budget to enhancing the 5 elements of the MOU. And those 5 elements span from our contribution to the ADF, shareholding, our contribution to developing the small and medium-sized enterprises, our commitment to develop the private sector, and more importantly, our commitment to enhance domestic resource mobilization. Domestic resource mobilization is the way forward for Africa, as we have to enhance our revenue collection, enhance our revenue to GDP as a block, to ensure that our development agenda is funded by our own resources that are internally generated. For example, if you look at the OECD countries that are the main donors, their revenue to GDP hovers around 30 to 35%. But for Sub-Saharan Africa, it is about 16%. That means that we are collecting domestically less than half of what the OECDs are collecting from their internal resource mobilization. So if this MOU is there to buttress the emphasis on domestic resource mobilization, and if we are able to even reach a significant percentage of the level of domestic resource mobilization of the OECD countries, this will unleash substantial resources for national economic development and make our development agenda very resilient. If we are able to enhance our nationally determined contribution to the Paris protocols for climate change, then that will mean that we can be able to trade any carbon credit, which will be another additional inflow. This carbon credit is at a nascent stage, but the scope is there if we climate-proof our economies better.
Of course, Sudan, as you know, is an agricultural country. We have vast agricultural opportunities. So we focus on resilience and the green economy. We put high priority on that. We already have our strategy for the blue economy and for the climate resilient policies. So we give this a priority, of course, and it is at the top of our plans.
Based on the MOU, we have committed to give $3 million towards revenue mobilization. For we in Sierra Leone, we have already a step ahead. What we have done, we just passed the Finance Act of 2023, whereby that act is going to bring about 2% of GDP, revenue to GDP, which is significant for us. And apart from that, what we have done also, we have ensured that we bring innovative financing method within our framework. One of them is to ensure that we excise tax, we improve on excise tax. Well, you know, Sierra Leone is a very, it's highly endowed with many resources. So we also set up an SPV that can ensure we manage our resources to ourselves. And in our estimations, these initiatives, we believe, will help to improve our revenue.
The African Development Bank has been standing for African countries, working with World Bank and other countries, or multilateral organizations, to mobilize resources and develop Africa. But they cannot do everything alone. African countries need to find a way to mobilize more resources internally. There are opportunities for doing that. Expanding your revenue, base, expanding your GDP, expanding your tax base can help to achieve that.
Another major point of discussion was between the African Development Bank Group and International Sustainability Standards Board on the urgent need for enhanced sustainability-related financial disclosures in the African region to leverage the capital markets.
For the past year, the IFRS Foundation has been working on sustainability and climate-related disclosures, and will be releasing standards at the end of June. Early adopters have been African countries, and here at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we actually announced the first adopters on the stage, and that was the African continent. The reason why it's so critical that we have these standards is it allows for comparable disclosures across different countries, across different sizes of entities. And those disclosures, data specific and non-data specific, are critical to unlock capital flows onto the continent.
We are very encouraged by a number of African countries wanting to be early adopters to benefit their private companies, unlocking that investment flow. But of course, for Global South in general and for Africa in particular, we need to also provide the necessary capacity building, knowledge support to make sure local companies and stakeholders are ready to adopt. And that's another reason we're here at the African Bank annual meeting, because we see African Bank as a critical partner in reaching stakeholders in the Africa continent. Ultimately, the future of Africa is about unlocking part of the 400 trillion global savings to become investment assets in Africa. Having the standards that we will publish very soon is a critical component of unlocking that global flow.
Now, the scope of crowding in more investment from outside Africa raises the task for investment and multilateral development banks as well as regional institutions to foster increased collaboration for sector-specific growth initiatives.
The Alliance for Green Infrastructure is a good example. It's a partnership between ourselves, Africa 50, the Africa Union Commission, AfDB's, and also Team Europe. It has Agence Française, it has EIB, it has the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, and also it has the non-state actors such as the Rockefeller Foundation as well. So this is all about partnerships. The idea is to really bring our resources together, and if we're successful at raising this $500 million specifically for project development and preparation, that could leverage $10 billion of investments into green infrastructure. Okay? And part of the key messages we're hearing here is private sector would want us to really work with governments to improve the enabling environment and actually create the regulatory and policy environment that gives certainty, okay, predictability. What we're also hearing is that we need to create de-risking instruments for the institutional investors to come in. So this would be pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, etc. That for them, they don't understand the asset class. So if we are willing to take a first loss, or we're willing to credit enhance bonds that they can invest in that will go towards green infrastructure, yes, they're willing to come in.
Because see, we want to do a lot more in terms of project preparation and project development to build up the pipeline of bankable projects that would be available for investors that are sitting on the side and really looking for good assets in which they can invest. So right now we are doing some project development and project preparation work in Africa in infrastructure space. For example, Africa 50 project development, this is what we are doing, but we want to scale up. Let me just give you some numbers. Right now, we have less than $100 million that are allocated to this business of project development and project preparation. With the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, we are seeking to raise 5 times $500 million for project preparation and project development, just to scale up the activity of project preparation so that we have that pipeline of green bankable project that will be really attractive to investors that they can come in and invest in those assets.
Finland is a firm supporter of multilateral organizations and also of the international rules-based order of which the multilateral banks are a part of. So we very much want to work together with countries and partners and to solve the global challenges that do not stay within the borders of one singular country. So we need to solve them together.
Our main priority is to try to link up our efforts in climate with our efforts on development, with a strong focus also on food security. And in that space, we can work with different partners, and the African Development Bank is one of those partners, different UN agencies, it can be civil society, but also the private sector, to help, again, spend our limited public funding in a way that unlocks private capital to really make a difference in climate, in food security and other important areas on the continent.
If we look around us and look at what the African Development Bank is doing, look at what the work that the AfDB is doing together with ourselves, with other multilateral institutions, our cooperation, very concretely on financing projects, large and small, across a whole range of different sectors and needs, that is very concrete proof that multilateralism works. And it is the fruit of dedicated hard work in these different institutions and our determination to cooperate together. I mean, certainly, you know, if we look at some of the big opportunities and challenges across the continent of Africa today, large-scale cooperation is essential to move the needle on some of these opportunities and challenges. And one of the recurring topics, I think, for us this year has been on the need for thinking big and taking a regional approach for a regional challenge or opportunity. And the African Development Bank are very well placed to catalyse that regional thinking and the development of regional strategies. And we're very pleased to be able to work together with them in this area where they can be so preeminent here on the continent.
We focus on what we call the global gateway initiatives, and that is a partnership which from EU EIB side is offered to create better connections, whether it's on transport, to work on climate and energy, to work on education and research on healthcare. We have seen in the COVID period how important that was, and on everything what is transport. And we talked on the connection of roads, of maritime transport and of air transport, of course, because nobody should be kept out, especially for countries like the smaller island states. This is very important to have as well, these connections with by air.
And another feature witnessed was the United Kingdom's launch of the first two projects under its Room to Run Guarantee program, which covers an €80 million Egyptian wastewater project and a €37 million water sanitation project in Senegal.
The UK first committed to the Room to Run guarantee at COP26 in Glasgow. The objective was to use guarantees from the UK government and the City of London insurance market to stretch the African Development Bank's balance sheet and rapidly scale up and speed up the climate finance available to African countries. Here, 18 months later, it's exciting to now be launching the first two projects supported by the guarantee in Egypt and in Senegal. At the heart of both these projects is the issue of safe, reliable and affordable access to water. Across the world, we know the climate is changing, temperatures are increasing, the weather is becoming less predictable, and this has a knock-on impact on health and food security.
Senegal has a very ambitious national development plan. Our national development plan called Plan Senegal Emergent has a critical pillar which is access to water for all. And this project contributes to that. Since the COP in Glasgow, I think a lot of the African countries are saying that the partners are not walking the talk. And I think today the UK is showing that the commitment to provide climate finance is real, and the amount is showing scale, because we're talking about $2 billion. Our country is committed to greening our economy, looking after our poorest, and we do that, most of it with our own resources. I like to say to most people that 85% of the budget of Senegal is Senegal's money. It's our taxes, it's everything else that we use, and our president has committed to very important to showcase how implementation is successful, so that we can build more and more on that success, be able to show multilateral development banks, bilateral committees, that we can actually also leverage more financing for the betterment of the continent. So this international partnerships anchored in the country ownership, MPs being there, but financing through bilateral, I think all of this is a very successful example of an ecosystem that can develop.
Some reassurances came from the Zimbabwe Debt Clearance Roundtable from representatives of the Southern Africa Development Community, the South African government, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, the United Kingdom, the USA, the EU, as well as the World Bank, IMF, Switzerland, and the United Nations.
We commend our development partners and the creditor countries for their patience, open and constructive dialogue, and for speaking with Zimbabwe on Zimbabwean issues. Distinguished participants, the technical and structured dialogue meetings will continue as a platform for inclusive, frank, and constructive dialogue, monitoring progress on the implementation of reforms by the government, technical level exchange of information, and channeling of technical support to the process from development partners. Allow me to express my gratitude to our champion, my young brother, President Adesina of the bank, African Development Bank, and our high-level facilitator, my dear brother, His Excellency, former President of the Republic of Mozambique, Comrade Chisano, for engaging the administration of the United States of America in May 2023.
The first major achievement is the dialogue itself. The process provided an opportunity for a constructive and open dialogue on a wide range of issues that are critical for Zimbabwe's re-engagement, with an effective participation of stakeholders. As a result of the very positive environment in which dialogue has been taking place, the stakeholders engaged with the necessary goodwill and were able to rebuild increasing levels of trust, as well as arrive at a consensus on a reform package.
I pray that we'll see a light at the end of the tunnel, and that light becomes a light, in fact, that will usher in, once we resolve all of this, a new Zimbabwe. And the president has said the most important thing today. He said, I will ensure that there is a free and fair election, because everything we are doing depends on that. If there is no free and fair election, if there is violence and all of that, and that's why I want to join President Chisano in urging for there to be a peaceful, calm, transparent, inclusive election, as the president has said.
Our embassy of Switzerland in Harare is involved and in supporting Zimbabwe in this process. So we are very supportive of what's happening, and I think it's a very encouraging environment that we have heard. A lot of commitment, a lot of vision, a lot of people together wishing that this resolution goes forward.
And it's now time to take a look at some exclusive chat with senior officials of the bank group, speaking on their portfolio, progress made, and some insight into future endeavors.
You know, you've got climate change on the one hand, but you also got a question from the G20 asking us how much more we can do with regards to mobilizing financing. Fortunately, the bank has been at the forefront of this. I think it's acknowledged that we've been leading on climate finance overall. We made a commitment that 40% of our annual financing will be climate. We're now at 43% or 45%. And then, of course, 68% of that is adaptation. So in terms of our own operations, which is important, climate finance is key. But so the way we are approaching this is to say that we can mobilize from our own resources, and we've made a 25 billion commitment, 12.5 billion of which will come from our resources, and 12.5 billion we want to mobilize. That's exactly. But in addition to that, we've done room to run a sovereign operation with the government of the United Kingdom and the private sector, which gives us 2 billion lending room for us to do more climate finance. In addition to this, we're looking at other BSOs, balance sheet optimization initiatives on the sovereign portfolio and also on the non-sovereign portfolio to mobilize additional headroom for us to do climate finance. But on the climate action window, we already have a couple of operations that are in place, and the idea is that we will supplement operations that we do in those countries to include climate adaptation in things like infrastructure projects, for instance. But in addition to that, we want to help a lot of the low-income countries work on their NDCs, work on their long-term strategies, because again, for money to flow to any particular area, there needs to be policy clarity. They need to know, the private sector needs to know what the rules are, with regards to this. So we think it's vital that all African countries, in fact, have NDCs and they have LTSs, and 70% of the climate action window is focused on adaptation, and 10% of the climate action window is also focused on technical assistance, with only a small amount for mitigation.
During these meetings, these annual meetings, I have met a number of potential donors, and I can confirm that there is very strong interest in contribution towards the climate action window. Because, and I'll explain why, because first of all, the climate action window provides a lot of the state donors or the state actors and donors with an opportunity for them to fulfill their commitments towards the doubling of adaptation that was agreed at COP26. So it is actually a channel through which they can be able to meet their climate commitments. Number one. Number two, we are also approaching philanthropists, what we call non-state actors. During the World Bank's annual meetings, we met a number of philanthropists, and they are all very excited about this particular product. They are saying, look, we understand Africa needs to adapt. And if Africa needs to adapt, especially the poorest part of Africa, and I must add this because the product of the climate action window is for what we call ADF countries, the poorest. And the importance of this is that 9 out of 10 of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world belong to these ADF countries. So in other words, you'll actually be able to be providing interventions to the people who need most.
When we look at, how negative the impacts are, the impacts of climate change, and also I would say environmental challenges on women, it is obviously something that we need to consider. Women that bear the brunt of crises, whether they are economic, environmental, political, social. So we really need to continue pushing to include those perspectives on everything we do, and that is what the African Development Bank does actually. There is also, so we also need to consider fragility, and context of transition, and that nexus between economic opportunities, fragility, and obviously instability. These are, I would say, 3 aspects on which we really need to work, and that's what we also do when we develop, programs that aim to support women's and also so that they can develop income-generating activities, and especially in areas that are affected by conflicts. And we do that with, civil society organizations, because they are key in that, because they are close to the ground. They also have this agility, and so for us, partnering with such stakeholders is very important when it comes to empowering women and girls in the context of fragility and transition, but also empowering women and girls when it comes to mitigate and adapt when it comes to climate change issues. So from our perspective, and when it comes to empowering women, last year we reached a significant milestone with our program, I would say our flagship program called Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, AFAWA. We were able to unlock $1 billion of the $5 billion goal that we have to bridge the gap that we know exists when that women face on the continent, and which is estimated at $42 billion. So we were able to reach that significant milestone, but that's not only that. We also now work with a large number of financial institutions across the continent, and our aim is obviously to scale up, but also to continue weighing when it comes to policy dialogue and when it comes to creating that enabling environment, pushing for more inclusive financial sector is key. And in this regard, dialoguing with economic ministers, as I like to refer to them, and also governors of central banks is key, because they are ideally placed to influence a wide range of issues by using the budget. We can work to have education sector work for women and include women and gender and girls, looking at education, water and sanitation. So that is why these stakeholders are key in this regard.
The water scarcity in North Africa is a big problem. So all the countries in North Africa, they are suffering from droughts. They are suffering from climate change. And you can see in many countries like Morocco, for example, in 2022, their wheat production has been reduced by 69%. This year, for example, in 2023, Tunisia, the first time in December, they don't have any rain. That means the situation is worse and worse and worse because of climate change. That's why in African Development Bank, we are really putting emphasis on food security in North Africa, especially how we can manage well water, how we can develop good projects and good strategies in agriculture to be able to produce more and to have this kind of water security and food security in the same time. And I have many examples of projects that we are doing in the region. Just recently, we started 2 years ago, or 1 year and a half ago, we start pushing and putting the frameworks and some kind of technical assistance for Mauritania to put a framework for PPPs. Now Mauritania is moving fast in the PPP project development with the private sector. The beginning of this year, they launched a lot of bidding processes to select private sector in different sectors, in energy, in roads, in solar energy, etc. And these projects now they are in the process of the bidding. We also in private sector. How we promote private sector? We have different level of promotion. We start with startups, for example. We have big programs in North Africa for startups. And we developed in the region, and we started in Tunisia at the beginning after the Arab Spring. For young people, we developed what we call Souq al-Tanmiya, which is a very good initiative where we help young people to develop their startups. And now we reach 800 startups that we promoted through this initiative in North Africa, no, only on Tunisia. And last year we have developed, extended this initiative to other countries in Egypt and in Morocco. In the same time, we are working now to develop a dedicated, what we call this youth investment banks in Tunisia, and we have already developed a process. And it will be not only for startups, but the whole value chain of private sector involvement in development in general.
Now, one of the things that we have done at the African Development Bank in the Water Department is for each country, we are preparing what we call country water security profiles. So basically, we capture the characteristics of the country in terms of water, using a water lens. So we understand the conditions, we understand the needs, and the interventions that are required to make a difference. Now, the bank has made a commitment to prioritize in terms of increasing water security the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region. And so those studies, we began with the countries in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. And this is being followed up now with interventions aimed at improving water security, improving water availability to the population for agriculture, for domestic use. So we do understand, based on the assessments that we have carried out, and we have the reports, we update these reports every so often, so that we are constantly aware of the situation in each of the countries, and the interventions that we make are all geared towards improving water security for each of the countries.
The key priorities for Rwanda without even climate change is boosting infrastructure, right? The bank has a portfolio of $1.5 billion in Rwanda as we speak, and 87% of that goes to water, sanitation, infrastructure, in energy and transport. And these are key sectors when it comes to climate change, where we need to climate-proof those investments to be able to make them sustainable and long-lasting, so that there is a better return on investment. And in those sectors, Rwanda also wants to mainstream, as the bank, climate change in all those infrastructure in terms of financing. So we are considering having some climate finance, the new climate action window, to be able to add the climate lend to those infrastructures. So Rwanda is really at the forefront. They have many of the instruments themselves, and climate mainstreaming, adaptation and mitigation is part of the global picture when it comes to sustainability of infrastructures. I think in general, the private sector in Rwanda is keen to invest in green economies. For instance, the circular economy is very prominent and popular, but these are small schemes, right? And when it comes to impactful investment, the country is yet to really focus on it. But we are making some positive moves in that direction. Recently, we are funded, the African Development Bank is funding an e-mobility project of 100 million, where the government is borrowing 100 million to be able to build infrastructure so that the private sector can come and buy e-mobility and e-buses. And the same goes to water. There is a big PPP that the bank has financed in the water sector for 20 million. So I think it boils down to awareness raising for the private sector to know that the bank is in funds, has investment in the private sector, which is not always the case. Private sector believes, and in many African countries, that we are more a public financing institutions. Yet we have massive money in private sector. It's a matter of raising awareness.
And here's some more sights and sounds from other side events, from the African Union Commission to the African Tax Administration Forum, as well as the African Bankers Awards and State Dinner. A closing ceremony conference wraps up takeaway points with journalists as the African Development Bank Group sets sail on its next line of action.
My question is addressed in two areas. One, listening to all what you've said and the feedback from the Board of Governors, the issue of speed comes to question. How fast can we then ramp up these resources that need to be mobilized? And the second question also correlates, links to it as well. Are you exploring other areas like sovereign wealth funds as well as the diaspora community? Thank you.
One of the areas in which we're going to have to move even much faster is how to mobilize more resources for the private sector. And we already have ways of we are going to do that. So at the Africa Investment Forum, which we held in November, and of course, let me thank CNBC Africa for being always the media that covers that for us. We will have a lot of focus on the private sector, mobilizing more private sector to go into green growth, green industries, green metal industries. And so that is an area that you will see speedy action. The other area of speedy action is on the issue of special drawing rights. So we need to have this year be 5 countries committed that will do rechanneling of SDRs to the African Development Bank. And the other area where you see speedy action from us is on the Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. We expect to go to our board of directors very soon with a few this year, and then we do more for next year. So we will continue as a bank to work with them on the issue of diaspora bonds in particular, so they can issue diaspora bonds. Egypt used diaspora bonds. Ethiopia also has diaspora bonds. Many countries have that. We'll continue to do that. And sovereign wealth funds and pension funds.
I've had the chance to have a discussion with Dr. Orama. They are talking about hybrid instruments, hybrid capital, convertibles, long-term debt, subordinated debt, and more important also there is an issue that is not addressed a lot, but I talked to Dr. Orama and he said they will even give it more thought. It's the currency risk for the countries that receive this. Most countries receive these funds in dollars or in euros, puts it in projects. These projects get local currency, and these are long-term projects. In 5-10 years, the currency they are paid 2 and 3 and 4 times what they have taken in the old exchange rate. That's a real crucial issue that not only does a problem, but hinders future financing for projects that need offtake, which are long-term offtake.
With all of the commitments and pledges from engagement on the sidelines of the 58th annual meetings of the African Development Bank, the clarion call is clear. It's time to act and unlock the potentials of Africa. Many thanks for joining along with us on the sidelines and highlights of activities that marked this year's annual meetings of the AfDB. Thank you once again for watching. I'm David Alabi.